Right, let's see where we can get to tonight with Job. Inevitably, when you study Job, you spend a lot of time in kind of the first three chapters and the last two or three chapters, because they're the ones that really set the scene and kind of sandwich all the conversations that go on in between. So I'm going to just turn up Job chapter 1, and in doing so, what I just want to start with really is to remind us of a little bit of where we got to last week, in that we were trying to ascertain really when Job lived, and we concluded he was pretty early in the history of mankind. Although his book's in the middle of the Old Testament, it's actually probably one of the earliest written, if not the earliest. And Job, what we've managed to pinpoint with a reasonable amount of accuracy, although some people will disagree with this, but most scholars agree, is that he lived sometime after the flood, but probably around the time of Abraham, certainly a long time before the law came into place. So fairly early in the history of God dealing with mankind. And that leads us on to a couple of questions, one of which is, who had authority on the earth at that time? And what we'll find is that in answering that question, that becomes quite important in understanding the narrative that you read in Job's chapters 1, 2, and 3. Because what we understand is that God gave man dominion on the earth in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, and that man, in choosing to follow Satan rather than follow God, effectively gave that dominion over to Satan. That's why Jesus, when he comes to earth, calls, he doesn't question whether Satan has the authority to give him the nations of the world, etc. And Paul calls Satan the god of this world. So when man fell, Satan effectively usurped that authority that God had given to mankind on the earth. So what happens as a result of that, you see from Adam onwards, that the world goes into a spiraling decline. It sets off with the first generation murder, and then we have all sorts of things happening until we get to the terrible days of pre-flood, when nobody is having any regard for God at all. They come through the flood, and God blesses Abraham and says that he's going to bless him, and that he's never going to put in place a worldwide punishment again like he did with the flood. And then, the next thing you find in the biblical narrative is man goes off on his own way again, under the kind of goading on of a guy called Nimrod, and decides that he's going to build a tower so that he can get as high in the world as God, and tries to build this thing called the Tower of Babel. God brings that down, and he scatters mankind by giving them different languages, confusing their languages. And by the time we get to Abraham's kind of the only man on earth that God can find to work with. I mean, we look at how bad the earth is now, but in terms of what it was like then, it was in a pretty bad way. Most of mankind had walked away from God, even though they'd seen what had happened to Noah. Still, subsequent generations had gone away, and the most powerful nation on earth is an evil nation. It's Egypt. And so that's kind of the background scenario to the time when Job lived. As I said, we don't know exactly when he lived. We do know where he lived, and we do know he was a wealthy man, and all the things that we talked about last week. So the question then becomes, and we read chapter 1 of Job last week. What was it that caused those tragedies to happen? And that's the big question, isn't it, with Job? What is it that causes these tragedies to happen? And we're given an insight to what is happening in the spiritual realm at the time these tragedies are occurring on earth. We've got this like dual picture of heaven and earth, and there's conversations and events taking place in heaven that have an effect that we're given to understand on events that happen on earth. And that's why people get this idea that God is kind of setting up this whole scenario just to prove what a big God he is. And it's almost like a game that he's playing with Satan. That's the way a lot of people think about this. They think that God provoked this, God brought this about. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. So what was it that opened the door to these tragedies? Well, we've already said that God blessed Noah and his descendants. He blessed Noah and his descendants not on the basis of what Noah and his descendants did. He blessed them out of grace. It was unmerited. So what we are dealing with on earth, pre the law, remember, is a covenant of grace and mercy. So not a dissimilar covenant to the one we have, but a covenant where you've got a very different balance of power between light and darkness. The victory of the cross hasn't occurred. And so God is responding to man on the basis of his own grace and his own mercy. His nature is to have mercy. And as a result of that, even though man keeps turning away from him, God's response to that is to offer mankind measures of protection. If you remember when Cain murdered Abel, Cain was given a mark on his head by God to protect him from the people on earth who might harm him. Noah and Noah's children are blessed, not on their own merits, but they were also protected through the flood, even though they weren't perfect, and subsequently they proved themselves to be very imperfect. And so we've got this covenant of grace, and that's a covenant between God and all mankind until Noah comes along and God institutes this Abrahamic covenant where he says, I'm going to bless you and bless all your descendants. You're going to be a father of many nations. Your descendants are going to be like the grains of the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky, and all those sort of things that we know. And that's the way that God is relating to mankind at the time of Job. Now, what we see in those first 2 or 3 chapters of Job is that although that's the way God's relating to mankind, it's not necessarily the way that Job is responding to God. That Job is, he's approaching this covenant of grace as a covenant of fear and of works and of sacrifices to pay for sin. So although God is trying to, he's working on the earth through grace and mercy, Job, by the way he's responding, he thinks it's down to him. He thinks he's got to do enough to fend off God, to stop him getting angry with his kids, to stop God's wrath. And, you know, he can never do enough. And eventually he says, you know, everything that I feared that I wouldn't do enough to stave off God, now it's all happened to me. And we remember last week that we said, well, not everything everybody says in the Bible is actually God saying it. And therefore we have to discern whether it's God speaking something or whether it's just an unknowledgeable person saying that thing, and not build doctrine around what an unknowledgeable person says. So we've got this covenant of grace, and Job really is approaching the relationship that he desires with God in the wrong way, in that he's seen it as a covenant of fear, works, and payment for sin. In other words, Job is kind of, in a funny sort of way, he's kind of preceding the law, in that he's got this idea, if I do good, I'll get good, and if I do bad, I'll get bad, which gets enshrined in the law under the idea of blessings and curses. So what's the conclusion from all that? The conclusion from what I've said in this little introduction tonight is this, that the conditions on earth were generally evil. God was protecting those who wanted to follow him, and he was blessing them through a covenant of grace and mercy. But Job was not operating under that covenant, didn't understand that covenant, and didn't relate to God in the way God was relating to mankind. And therefore, what was he doing? He was outside that covenant of grace. He was standing, you know, Paul in the New Testament talks about the grace in which we stand. Well, Job was managing to stand right outside the grace. And where does that put him? That puts him in open fields, in a world where the enemy has the authority. So Lord Job thinks he's trying to do the right thing to please God. What the reality is, he's outside the covenant of grace, and therefore he's wide open to what the enemy does. He's operating in the enemy's territory, not God's. Okay, so that's kind of an introduction, and that we'll see that's going to be really important when we actually try and understand this conversation that God has with the devil, with Satan, and then what happens after that. Just one final point though before I kind of move on. One of the things that we noticed last week when we looked at chapter 1 is that Job was pretty keen on offering sacrifices for his children's sin. Do you remember that? That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because again, there's nowhere in the, I know some people do this, but there isn't actually really anywhere in the Bible that talks about being able to repent for another person's sin. The Bible sees us all as responsible for our own actions, and repentance is an individual act. So that there isn't repentance for another person's sin, except that seems to be what Job had got as an idea, that he could repent for his children's sins. Now, remember, Job keeps getting referred to as this righteous man, and so therefore we get this question, well, okay, if Job is he's doing this crazy thing about repenting for his children's sin, isn't that sinful? Well, no, it's not sinful. It's just ineffective. It doesn't do anything. You see, not everything we do is sinful, but that doesn't mean it achieves very much. It's the same for us in living today. Not everything we do is bad, but that doesn't mean that it's sinful. You know. No, I didn't say that right. You see, we can do good things and you know, nothing wrong with them, and yet if they distract us from God and stop us walking our purpose just because we fill our lives with good things, those good things kind of become bad things, don't they, or become ineffective things. They hamper us in our relationship with God rather than doing good. So Job wasn't actually sinning here; he was just ineffective. It was a bit of a, it didn't do anything under the covenant. Okay, so let's go to chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the adversary, Satan, also came among them. And the Lord said to the adversary, where have you come from? Or from where have you come? Some translations, I don't know if any of you got this, some translation says, why are you here? How come you've got here? That's the kind of the idea of it. Now, just want you to think a little bit more deeply about this, because I was kind of trying to understand what was going on in this dynamic, in this conversation. And what God really dropped into my spirit is, of course, I always knew what he was doing there. I always knew where he'd been. So after all, I'm omniscient. I know everything that goes on. So this isn't a question where God is trying to ascertain where Satan's come from and what he, you know, where he's been, what his activity has been. God already knows. And we need to kind of bear that in mind, that God would already know what Satan had been up to. He didn't, you know, this isn't a question where he's trying to find out as such. And what does Satan say? He says, the adversary answered the Lord, saying, from roaming on the earth, from walking up and down on it. Some different translation would be from going to and fro, roaming around on the earth. That's kind of the one I remember it is. So what was he doing? What was Satan doing that God had observed? Just think about this. What had God seen that Satan was doing? Well, he was roaming around, wasn't he? So what was he doing when he was roaming around? Well, he was scheming and planning to bring destruction, to steal from men. How do I know that? Well, let's just see, because his methods don't change. But if you go to you don't need to turn to it, but I'll just read it to you. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, which is a verse I've preached on quite a lot in the early autumn. Be sober and watchful, because your adversary the devil prowls around, going to and fro as a roaring lion, seeking who he may devour. He hasn't changed. He still wanders around on the earth looking for who he can devour, who he can bring, whose lives he can bring destruction in, what he can do to get up to that. So God's seen him doing that, and he's saying, okay, so where have you been? What have you been doing? And the adversary says, well, I've been going all around looking, walking up and down on the earth looking for what I can do. And so the question is, why Job? How does Job get into this scenario? Well, because one thing that we know about Job is he's recognized as a very righteous man. That means he's, compared to a lot of people on the earth at that time, he's doing really well. We know that nobody's perfectly righteous, but Job is one of the most holy people on earth. He's one of the most, the hardest triers on earth. He might not have got it all right, but he's recognized as a righteous man. And Satan knows that if he can take out the most righteous one, there'll be a lot of others that follow, because they'll look at that and go, well, look what happened to Job. If that happened to him, it can happen to anybody. I'm not having anything to do with that, God. I'm just going to go my own way. I'm going to rebel and so on. So Satan's got the strategy here that he wants to take out the most important representative of that time, which is Job, the one who is trying to be righteous. So what do we do in that sort of situation? Well, the New Testament says that our response to the enemy is that we need to be alert, be sober, make a careful assessment, cast our anxieties on God, because God cares for us. And, the Bible clearly addresses and identifies Satan always as our adversary. He's the one who's against us. God isn't our adversary. Jesus isn't our adversary. Satan's our adversary. I'm just going to take a little detour just for a couple of minutes, if you will, because I'm aware that Anne sent me in a question about 2-3 weeks ago just on this particular point, because I was talking about John chapter 10, verse 10, where Jesus says, the thief comes to steal, kill and destroy, but I come so that you may have life in all its abundance. And I've made this report many times, and Ange knows I've made this point many times, that Jesus is saying there, the enemy is the one that does the bad stuff. I'm the one that brings the good stuff. Now, Ange had come across an article that suggested or said, well, that's really not the right analysis, because what Jesus is talking about there is he's not talking about Satan, he's talking about the Pharisees and the scribes of the time and so on. And he'd already had a couple of run-ins with them previous to that. And I understand all that, I get all that, and that's quite right, Ange. But what needs to be added into that is the fact that Jesus had already told the scribes and the Pharisees they were operating under the influence of the devil. So whilst he's talking to scribes and Pharisees, he's also talking to the one who is influencing that heart in them. In John chapter 8, a couple of chapters before, right at the beginning of this verse, he tells the Pharisees that Satan is their father. He's the one who's motivating their actions. And so that's why, most people take that verse in John chapter 10 to say, that the God is about bringing good, the enemy's about bringing bad, and it's really clear between the two. And so for us, our response as new covenant believers is to resist Satan. It says, submit yourselves to God, resist Satan, and he will flee from you. That's James chapter 1. Is it chapter 1? No. I think I've written that down wrong. I think it's... no, I think let me just check that, because I'm annoying myself now. James, because I think I've written it down wrong when I was making my notes. James chapter 4 verse 7, not chapter 1 verse 7. It says, submit yourself to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God and he'll draw near to you, etc., etc. Anyway, that was a bit of an aside because I wanted to ask that question because I was conscious that if I tried to write it out, it would be a very long explanation. So I just wanted to be clear on that. So Satan is doing what he's always done. Well, let's get back to Job. Satan's doing what he's always done. He's wandering through and fro, trying to bring destruction on mankind and anybody he can find. And then we get to verse 8, and this is kind of the really big verse that everything hangs on. This is where people read this verse, and because we go to it with almost like a preconceived notion about what's happening here, we read it and we think, well, God's setting this up, God's initiating this, God's working in this to basically cause these series of events, and it's that mysterious way of God, and we can never understand what he's up to, and he's making this happen in order to do certain things and prove a point to Satan, and that Job's an unfortunate victim of what God's doing. And therefore, what people will say is, well, God's still God, and therefore we just have to take that on the chin, trust God, and know that all his suffering eventually acts for our redemption, or something along those lines. People come up with all sorts of ideas around that. I'll say to you now, I do not believe in any way that is what this verse says, unless you go to it with that prejudgment idea. In fact, a lot of commentators, not from our generation, but previous generations, agree with me on this. That the bulk of commentators in previous generations will agree with me on this. It's kind of something that's developed in the last 100 years or so, this idea that Job's all about God initiating this suffering of Job's. And so let's have a look at verse 8. And the Lord said to the adversary, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and an upright man who fears me, or fears God, and avoids evil. So if you look at that on a surface level, I agree, you will probably end up at the conclusion I've just told you not to end up at. Because it says, it looks like that the Lord said to the adversary, so that's God saying it, have you considered my servant Job? Well, of course, the question is, if Satan had never come across Job, then God's drawing his attention to him. He's almost saying, like, Job's my superhero. Have you thought about him? Because he'll do you down, Satan. Okay, so the question, what we really need to understand from that is, what is God actually saying in the original language, and what does it mean? Because our problem is we read something in English and it can give us a different impression than we would get if we read it from the original words that were there. And the reason for that is you can't translate one language directly from one to another. And any translation will often start by going backwards, because what do we understand this is saying, and get back to give you the translation, rather than trying to open it wider. So it all comes down to this one word, considered. So if God is saying, hey, Satan, you haven't noticed my servant Job, but I'm going to draw your attention to him now, and I'm telling you he's a blameless and upright man. Want to take the bet, Satan? Now, that if you read it that way, the crucial word in all of this is considered. Would you agree? Yeah, okay. So when you look at more literal translations, so Young's literal translation says this: and Jehovah said to the adversary, have you set your heart upon and against my servant Job, because there's none like him in the land? I'll say that again, because that's very different, isn't it? And Jehovah said to the adversary, have you set your heart upon and against my servant Job, because there's none like him in the land? In other words, when you were wandering about to and fro, have you set your heart on Job? Is that who you're going to go for next? Hebrew translation, so the Hebrew translation of, from the Hebrew Bible says this: why have you set your heart on my servant Job? Again, that's very different from the way we read it in our English. The two Hebrews words there, hasamta, which means to place, to put, to set, or to lay a violent hand directed towards. So hasamta means to lay a violent hand directed towards, place that hand or set that hand. And then the other part of the word that gets translated in that considered is libaka. And that means the inner man or the heart in the midst of man, the seat of the appetite. So it said, have you set your violent hand, are you directing your actions towards getting the heart of Job for yourself? Okay, now that's very different from God saying, have you noticed my servant Job, isn't it? And yet that's a more accurate way of looking at those characters. Everywhere else in the Old Testament, those characters that make up this word that is translated considered, everywhere else in the Old Testament, they're translated set your heart upon. Just give you some more kind of, what would you say, corroboration of that. So I use various study tools, and there's an old commentary called Gill's, which I kind of like it. I think it has some really great insights. This is what Gill's has to say about this word and what's happening here. He's saying, hast thou put thy heart, he's an old writer, so you have to go with the hast and the these. Hast thou put thine heart on my servant? Not in the way of love and affection for him, but rather his heart was set upon him in a way of desire to have him in his hands and destroy him. It's the same as the way Satan set his heart and desire on sifting Peter. Do you remember that in the New Testament? That's what this commentator Gill is saying. It's the same idea. The sense of the question is, since thou sayest thou hast been walking up and down on the earth, hast thou not taken notice of Job, cast an eye on him, and wished in your heart to have him in thy hands to do to him hurt? I know you have. Have you not contrived in your heart how to tempt him, and draw him from my service and into sin and snares in order to reproach and accuse him? But there's none like him, and so I oppose the accusations and charges Satan came with against him. So what that gives us is a very different picture. It's Satan going to and fro throughout the earth, seeing that Job is the kind of the representative. If he can get him to fall, many will fall behind him. And God saying, I know what you're up to. You've set your heart to destroy Job, but you can't come before me to accuse him and charge him in front of me, because I am not accepting those charges, because I relate to Job on the basis of what? Grace. Okay? And so the Adam Clark commentary says this, literally, this means, hast thou placed thy heart on my servant Job to have him? Another one, the Barnes commentary, set thine heart on means more than to merely observe or look at, since it's abundantly manifest that Satan had attentively considered Job and had been desirous of injuring him. It means to set himself against Job, to fix the heart on with intention to injure. Okay, so where do I get to from that? Where do we get through? Because this is, I realize I'm now starting to take you into territory you might not have seen before or seen talked about before in respect to the book of Job. So what can we tell from this? Well, the first thing we can tell is that even though Satan had authority on earth, it was still possible at that time for mankind to make good or bad choices. And Job was generally making good choices, even if he didn't really understand the covenant that he had. Secondly, Job's willpower and fear of God meant that he was not giving in to Satan's temptations. You know, Job was doing anything to avoid getting involved in anything, wasn't he? And hopefully to try and cover his kids in the meantime. Third thing we see is that the enemy had been actively trying to get him to sin and to turn from God. He'd been trying to get him to turn away from God. Now, what I want you to see from this is, whilst people try and extrapolate Job to our own time and throw it into the whole discussion about healing and deliverance and health and full life and all the rest of it, you are not in the same position now as Job was then. The world is a very different place. The authority that Satan has is very different. The authority that you have is the authority that Christ has given you as a result of the victory of the cross when he won victory over Satan. And although you are under a covenant of grace, we receive that grace through faith in the victory and the price that Christ has already paid. Job wasn't in that situation at all. So what's going on here, even if you got the idea that God was doing all this and God was prompting it, which he's not, it's still, you have a different covenant in a different time, in a different scenario. This does not apply to you. It's like, you know, somebody coming along and saying, I don't know, let me pick on somebody. Elenid, you've done something wrong. There's a really obscure law in Outer Mongolia that says it is against the law throughout the world to wear blue and red at the same time. So, Elenid, we're going to prosecute you. Well, of course they can't. Why? Because that law doesn't apply to you. You are living in a different place, in a different time, in a different scenario. And that's what we've got. So whilst this is all true about Job, you cannot just take it and say that applies to us, because it doesn't. It's a very different setup, a very different time of God's dealing with mankind. Okay, so so let's go on to verse 9. Then the adversary answered the Lord, saying, has Job feared God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. Okay, so why is God blessing the works of Job's hand and his possessions increasing in the land? So the question is, what we've got here, so I'll finish the passage first, but stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he's going to curse you to your face. So remember, Satan is again identified as the accuser or the adversary. His purpose is to steal, kill, and destroy. And Satan comes and he brings this accusation. This is an actual accusation he's mentioned. And what he's saying is this: yes, Job is righteous on the outside, but his motives are wrong on the inside. And therefore, I've got a valid accusation against him. Because God's saying, you have no accusation against this man. And Satan's saying, yes, I have. I'm telling you, God, that although his actions look good, his motives on the inside are wrong. And the issue is, God, that you've been blessing him and treating him with grace when actually he deserves punishment, because although it all looks great, he's actually doing something wrong here, God. So he's trying to show that Job is doing something wrong. Now, why is he right in saying Job is being blessed? Well, let's have a look. I'll just remind you of the covenants that we're under. So there's the covenant with Noah. Remember, Job just comes along after Noah. This covenant's still in place, and this is the covenant that God made with Noah. God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Every beast of the earth, every bird of the sky, and all that moves on the earth, fish of the sea, will fear you. They're given into your hand. Every moving thing that lives is food for you. I give you everything, just as I gave you the green plant. And then just a bit further down, it says, God said, this is, as for me, this is I'm in Genesis chapter 9. This is verse 8. Again, God spoke to Noah and his sons with him, saying, as for me, establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you. That includes Job. And with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and all that, I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again shall be a flood to destroy the earth. And so he's blessing them, and he's saying that I'm never going to bring about punishment and destruction in that way again. So the descendants of Noah were blessed. And then we see again what happens with Abraham. Now, the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country, your family and your father's house to the land I show you. I'll make you a great nation. I will bless you. I'll make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I'll bless them who bless you and curse you who curses you. And in all the families of the earth will be blessed. So Job, if he's blessing, even if he's not operating properly within the Abrahamic covenant, if he's blessing Abraham and Abraham's descendants, then he's blessed himself. And the same under the Noahic covenant, blessing, there's a general blessing on all mankind. And that's, so what Satan is saying there is true. You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in land. Yes, because that's the covenant that he has. That's what he's entitled to. But Satan also says this, is Job feared God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? So what Satan's going to do is he's going to argue that although Job looks good on the outside, really God's been deceived because Job's motives are wrong on the inside. I'll read you another one of these old commentaries. Ellicott's commentary says this: Satan knows that the motive in an action is its only value, and by incrimination, I can't read this word, calumniates the motives of Job. Matthew Hedney says, this is the common way of slanderers, suggest that which they have no reason to think is true. There is nothing we should dread more than really being hypocrites. It's not wrong to look at the eternal recompense in our obedience, but it's wrong to aim at worldly advantages in our religion. So it's raising this question for us today, because we don't read the Old Testament just to try and work out what's going on. We actually need to know what it's saying to us today. And so we have a question for us today. If, this question that Satan's bringing and accusing Job with, it raises this question for us. Why do I do what I do? What are my motives in my relationship with God? Do I love God for what God can do for me, or do I love God for who he is? And they're two very different things. And what he's doing here, what Satan's coming along and saying here, is the only reason that Job loves you, God, is because of what you do for him. Take that away and you'll find out he doesn't really love you. He isn't really devoted to you. Take away the blessing and you'll find out that there's no relationship there. That's not unique in the Old Testament, although it's later. One of the things that happens, and I remember this from a course that we ran really early in the life of Faithlife, called A Heart Ablaze. And John Bevere talked about this, and he talked about the attitude of the Israelites, and this particular instance from Deuteronomy chapter 5, and where there's two different responses to the presence of the Lord. Moses goes up into the presence to hear God, and the people move away in fear. And the question is, why was those two different responses? We find out from Psalm 103 and other places that the people loved God for what his works, but Moses knew his ways. Moses knew what God was like. He had a real relationship with him. But the people only wanted him for what he could do for them. And so, you know, in our Christianity, in our faith today, we have a big question: is why do we want God? Do we want him for who he is, or only for what he can do for us? And if we aren't getting what we want from him, will we walk away? And sadly, I find that's kind of becoming an ingrained attitude amongst so many Christians. That as long as everything's going great, they have a good relationship with God, and if something starts to go wrong in their life, they turn away from God and fall away. And so Satan is saying that's what's going to happen to Job if you take away the blessings from him. And he turns around and he says to God, but I can't get at Job like you think I can, because there's a hedge around him. You've put a hedge around him. Now, it's really important, again, to remember that just because somebody says something doesn't mean it's correct. The only correct things that get said in the Bible is when God or Jesus says them, or God or Jesus confirms that they're correct. God never confirms this is correct. In fact, he says the exact opposite. So Satan said, I can't get at him because you put a hedge around him. So I've lost my place. Hang on a sec. Yeah, so let me just backtrack a second. Satan was accusing that Job liked the blessings of God and he was afraid of God, but if the blessings were taken away, Job would walk away. And then in verse 9, he says, then the adversary answered, Job has feared God for nothing. Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? Now look at verse 11. Stretch out your hands now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. So what's his game? What's he trying to do? He's trying to get God to do to Job what he himself wants to do to Job, which is to bring destruction in his life. So Satan's come and he said, hey, God, the reality is, you know, you blessed Job. That's the only reason he likes you. His motives aren't right in his heart. Therefore, you should go and punish him, God, because he's not really following you. So he's trying to trick God to go against his covenant of grace and mercy. He's trying to get God to take action against Job, despite the fact that God has said he has a covenant of grace and mercy. And so we get this question of this hedge around him. So who's saying it? That's always the best question to ask. Well, the person who's saying it is Satan. What do we know about Satan? He's the father of lies. There's no truth in him. And what he's doing, it's really important to see that God doesn't acknowledge that that is correct. And he doesn't agree that there is a hedge around Satan. In fact, what God says is, under the covenant of grace at that time, he blesses and he protects through that covenant. But the God of this world, outside of that covenant, is Satan. And then we get to verse 12. Then God said to the adversary, look at all he has. Look, all he has is in your power. Only do not stretch your hand against him personally. So you can't touch him, but everything he's got, because he's outside my covenant, because he's not taking hold of the grace that's there, he's wide open to you. You don't have to come and try and get me to do anything. You can do that. Under the covenant that's in operation on the earth and the authority that Satan has on the earth, God is saying to him, there is no hedge. You already are able to do these things, Satan. So don't come to me trying to trick me to do it to Job when you won't do it and can't do it yourself. And as a result of that, through my mercy, through my grace, I'm protecting Job. I'm not protecting all these things, but I'm protecting Job. What did Job do to deserve that? Well, he went after God's own heart in his way, but just had got it in a mess. And so God responds to that. God responds to that heart motive from Job by grace and gives him personally protection. He's not giving Satan permission to control Job's life. He's saying the fact is Satan already has access to Job because he's got authority on earth when man gave it to him in Eden. So God, when he says this, so Satan is incorrect when he says God's put a hedge around Job and all his possessions and all the rest of it. However, the result of that, the result of Satan coming with that is that God actually then puts personal protection on Job as an act of grace and mercy, and then correctly states all that Job has is in your power. Well, all that Job had was in Satan's power because he's the God of the world at that time. He's the one with authority on earth. The only way God was able to operate on earth was through men who would respond to his grace and mercy. That's the condition that mankind had got himself in by the time we get to Abraham. He's looking for people who respond in faith to his grace and mercy. And so other people are wide open. Now, there is something that is called general grace. What general grace is the sort of thing that happened with Noah when God says, I'm not going to wipe out the whole world again. I'm going to send rain and sun and there'll be rainbows. And every time you see the rainbow, it'll be a sign that you're under my grace. But I'm going to send the rain and the sun on those who deserve it and those who don't deserve it, because I'm a God of grace. And so that's God's general grace. When you read a systematic theology, they call it common grace. That's the goodness of God that affects everyone, irrespective of whether they deserve it or not. So we all live on a beautiful earth that has the rain, has the sun, has fresh air most of the time, and all the rest of it. So we're all blessed generally because we live on earth and we've got life. That's common grace. But then, there's a specific covenant of grace. And God's saying that outside of that specific covenant of grace, other than the existence of common grace, when everybody gets good things off me, then everything belongs to Satan. He's the one in authority at this time. Let's get to verse 12. The Lord said to the adversary, look, all he has in your power, only do not stretch out your hand against his person. That word translated there, in mine it's look. Some of you probably got behold. It's a Hebrew word, hineh, Hinneh. And what it means is, indeed it is, surely, look and see. So he's saying, look, surely, indeed it is, look and see, everything that he has is already within your power. So what then happens? Let's see where we are. I'll finish shortly. Okay, so I'll just summarize all that, then we'll leave it till next week. Under a covenant of grace, God works by the way he always wants to work, his first choice, which is by relationship. God is more interested in relationship than he is in religion. That's why he still has regard for Job, even though Job had got himself all in a mess and didn't really understand the way God was relating to him. So God works by relationship, and God knows Job's heart is for him. But God also always operates by covenant. So you've got the desire of God to operate in and live in relationship with Job. He knows Job's heart's for him, but he also will not break his covenant, and he operates by that covenant. And under grace, God works with us where we are. So he's working with Job. he's trying to draw him to him, and he knows, and it's the same for us because we have a covenant grace. He knows we're not always going to get everything right, but what he desires is this relationship with us. And what happens here is there's a kind of a parallel with what happened with Cain. You remember Cain murdered Abel, and what happened as a result of that is that Cain said, "Oh God, if you cast me out, all these people are going to come and they'll kill me," and so on. And God, as an act of grace and mercy, puts a mark on Cain called we know about the mark of Cain, puts a mark on him so that nobody can harm him. And he does exactly the same thing, not necessarily with a mark, but a prohibition here with Job, that he knows Job's after his heart. He knows that he's operating outside the covenant, but almost in a way to say to Satan, you are not going to trick me into doing the thing you want to do, which is harming Job. You're not going to do that. And as a result of you trying that, I'm going to protect Job because you accused me of doing that, but now I'm actually going to do it. I'm going to put some protection on Job's life. Did Job do anything to do that, deserve that? Well, he'd not done. The whole thing isn't based on deserving anything, is it? Because it's grace. God gives grace. And so what we see here is Satan going to and fro, looking for whom he can destroy, coming. He's challenged by God who knows where he's been, and God nails him and says, "You've set your heart on my servant Job, haven't you?" And Satan's response to that is to accuse Job and say, "You see, the problem is here, God, if you really had a relationship with Job that you think you have, you would realize that although he's doing all these good things, although he looks great, he really has bad motives because he's only after you for what you can get. And therefore, God, if you take it all away from him, he won't follow you." And God says, "I'm not taking it all away from him. You're not going to trick me into doing that, Satan. That's not the way we work. And because you've done that, I'm now going to protect Job personally from you. But everything else he has, you know, is already in your power. But you're not going to get me to take it away. If you want to prove your point, if you think that's the way it is, Satan, you're going to have to take it away because you can. And you know you can. But you are not going to get me to break my covenant of grace by tricking me into taking it away. And I'm going to make it harder for you now, Satan, because I'm going to protect Job. Because that's the thing you tried to trick me with. What you intended for harm, I now intend for good. Amen.